This story is about a group of teenagers that grew into men that ran the streets of Florida. They would take no prisoners and punish the opposition with heavy metal, and with no consideration for life, they would travel a road that would lead them to more than 600 years behind bars. Before we begin, let's get some understanding. In the early 1990s, a group of young men were each their own individual leader, hustler, and body snatcher. All of them engaged in violence and the sale of powder. Because of the difficulty and safety of the witnesses for all the murders that were being committed, prosecutors had to get creative and figure out a way to protect the general public. So they found that the commonality between these men was a thug from the Matchbox Projects. His name was Kenneth Williams, known in the streets as Black. The media called him Kenneth Boobie Williams. Then they labeled him the leader of a gang, and they called that gang the Boobie Boys. And this is the story.
Investigators say most of the violence can be attributed to the Boobie Boys, a ruthless gang named after Kenneth Boobie Williams.
In the year 1987, back in Miami, a boy named Kenneth Williams was riding in a car with his friends. When they saw three other boys on a corner, they hopped out and did the unthinkable. Two of those boys were hit and survived. As for the third boy, he didn't make it. His name was Gary. The two survivors told law enforcement that Kenneth did it. Kenneth was charged with 1 count of first degree and 2 counts of attempted. He pled guilty to lesser charges and was sent to a juvenile detention center where he would meet other fatherless and violent teenagers. One of those teenagers was a boy named Casado, and they would develop a friendship over the next few years. Carroll City, Overtown, Little River, Liberty City are all part of this story. About 4 years after the murder of Gary, Kenneth would be released sometime around 1991, and by then, he had made up his mind to live a life of crime and punishment, and that's exactly what he did. That same year, a man named Will was hit. He didn't make it. Before he passed on, he identified 2 members of the B-Boys as the men that did it. Kenneth would later hook up with a man named Charles. See, Charles was a longshoreman that worked at the port of Miami. Charles would use fake passports and fly overseas and make deals with the producers, who would then transport the product from Central and South America to the Bahamas, then to Miami. The B-Boys would then flood the streets of 25 cities in 12 states with product fresh off the boat. By 92, Kenneth and his associates were selling bundles and involved in stick-ups, home invasions, and robberies. That same year, he went to a club named Club Rolex. As he was walking through the parking lot, he made eye contact with a man he had beef with, and so he pulled out to use his weapon, but it jammed. His intended target, who was a member of the rival Thomas gang, was also about that life, so he returned the favor, and Kenneth was hit. He survived and learned a valuable lesson that night. The responding officer said he always thought it was strange that the victim didn't want to cooperate, but little did he know, that victim was a general in the streets. Around this time, a woman named Suzanne was making moves out of her house in Overtown. Her sons, who were 2 young twin brothers at the time, was learning how to hustle and commit crimes that would one day get them a sentence of life behind bars. The twins would go on to be major players in a war against Vonda and the Thomas gang. On Christmas Day, a man named James was hit. He didn't make it. This happened right in front of the house of the boss, and this was courtesy of the B-Boys for something that happened earlier. On the last day of 1993, members of the Thomas gang spotted members of the B-Boys at a gas station. As they unloaded, the only people that were hit was an accountant and another man from Queens, New York, who was in town visiting friends and family. He felt lucky and was buying lottery tickets. These 2 men didn't know each other, but they had one thing in common. They didn't make it. They both became innocent victims of the streets of Miami, as members of the Thomas gang exchanged slugs with the B-Boys. The game of revenge would continue. The Thomas gang would continue to punish members of the B-Boys whenever they caught them slipping. And on a day when some of the hustlers associated with the B-Boys was at a barbershop, Thomas gang drove by and unloaded 90 times from an assault rifle. A man named Duke and a man named Johnny was hit. Johnny survived. As for Duke, he didn't make it. The B-Boys wasn't having it. In less than 24 hours, they would get revenge for Gary by punishing a member of the Thomas gang, a man named Benny. Benny got hit and fell to the ground as he tried to escape what he knew what was about to happen next. The B-Boys walked up on him while he was on the concrete and did the unthinkable. He didn't make it. An electronic communication device called a beeper was found at the scene of the crime. This was a big mistake made by one of the B-Boys, because after the investigators found it, they called the numbers that was stored in the beeper, and the people on the other side of the phone line answered that this was the number they used to get in contact with a man named Rogers. So, of course, Rogers and the people he's associated with became the lead suspects for what happened to Benny. Without giving Benny's family time to grieve, 2 days later, they stalked Benny's brother. When they found him, they unloaded, hitting the brother and his friend. They were all taken to the hospital and survived. Before the rapper Trina was a star, Back in her high school days, she dated a young man named Derek. Derek just happened to be the brother of future rapper Drake Daddy. On a sunny day in June, Derek took Trina out on a date. He dropped her off and hooked up with one of his friends so they could handle some business. She went to bed, and the next morning woke up to some horrible news. It was reported that in Opelika at 1:30 in the morning, 2 victims were found inside their car. Derek was one of those victims. His friend Walter was the other. They were hit more than 50 times with an assault. It was reported that this was no mistake, and it was the work of the B-Boys. It seemed like it was a known thing that in the streets both men had an issue with the B-Boys. Walter's mother and the father of Derek both testified that before this incident, their sons were in fear that Kenneth was plotting on removing both of them. Law enforcement would have other information that linked Kenneth and Casado to what happened that night. An associate of the B-Boys testified that he was told this was related to what happened at the barbershop where Duke and Johnny was hit, and the B-Boys hit Derek and Walter as revenge. What happened that night was seen by a neighbor. This is a story told by that neighbor. The neighbor said he saw car number 1 chase the men, but the car crashed. Another car number 2, pulled up and the 2 men got out and unloaded. The hitters got back into car number 2 and took off. The neighbor then walked over to the victim's car and saw the unthinkable and called the police. The neighbor then identified 2 members of the B-Boys as the ones that did it. Another event took place at an apartment complex in Miami. The B-Boys hustled in these apartments, but so did a small-time dealer named Cooper. A Miami detective stated that an eyewitness told him that a man got out of a Lincoln Town car and did the unthinkable to Cooper. At that time, Casado was known to be driving around in a blue Lincoln Town car. At the time, he didn't know it, but he was the obvious suspect. A lot of hustlers and killers from Florida were sentenced to many years behind bars. Since they were in the game before going to prison, they all had interactions with members of the B-Boys. So to get their sentence reduced, they wore wires and requested interviews with detectives working the case, so they could trade information for a reduced sentence. One of those prisoners told the detective a story that linked the B-Boys to another lost soul. From a jailhouse interview, he said that a hustler named JB had beef with this member of the B-Boys, and JB had planned to rob them. The detective testified that the jailhouse informant told him that the B-Boys hired his brother to get rid of JB. In response to a different situation, Vonda's gang would get revenge on a Thursday by doing a drive-by on a 22-year-old named Rogers in broad daylight. However, Rogers survived. The next day, a group of friends from Overtown went to a club in B-Boys territory in Carroll City. They had a good time partying and drinking. Not aware of what happened a few hours earlier, they left the club and took the expressway home. An hour later, police was called to investigate a car accident of a car that crashed into a tree. While the friends were on the highway headed home, another car pulled up side by side doing 90 miles an hour. An assault rifle poked out the window and unloaded. The driver lost control and the car flew off the highway and was stopped when it hit a tree. Of the 4 men in the car, only one of them made it. An autopsy was performed, and after further investigation, those men were gone before they hit the tree. The cause of death was multiple hits from an assault rifle. A detective testified that the survivors named one member of the B-Boys as the person that did it. The next day, an informant would name 3 members of the B-Boys as the men that did it. That informant named Kenneth, Casado, and Rogers. 2 months later, on a Wednesday, a man named Otis, who was a small-time dealer, drove his car into an apartment complex and parked in a parking spot. He was familiar with the neighborhood because he hustled out of these group of apartments. But associates of the B-Boys also hustled there. A few months back, Otis and members of the B-Boys exchanged words and slugs, so the B-Boys put some money on his head. And today was the day to collect that bounty. Otis was in the driver's seat. A woman was in the front passenger seat with her 5-year-old child sitting on her lap. Another man, let's call him Pierre. Pierre was in the back seat, and he told the following story. He said while they were parked, he saw men in ski masks that came out of nowhere. They had assault rifles, and they used them again and again, over and over. Then they left. The driver, Otis, was the main target. He didn't make it. The woman in the front passenger seat was taken to the hospital. She didn't make it. Michael, the 5-year-old sitting on her lap, was taken to the hospital with a slug from an assault stuck in his brain, so he was unable to think. 2 days later, he didn't make it. Pierre survived and was able to testify to these events. He also named 2 members of the B-Boys that he saw right before the incident took place.
And that's exactly what police say happened to 5-year-old Michael Frazier. Cops say Michael was sitting on his mother's lap in her boyfriend's car when the Boobie Boys opened fire on the boyfriend. All three were down.
The investigators picked up all the shells, and when they got back to the lab, they discovered that some of the shells matched the incident that happened 8 months ago at the Blue Lakes apartments that involved that blue Lincoln Town car. But even worse, the man that drove the getaway car to the event and then drove the car away from the event would later testify in front of a grand jury, so he could get less time. He told the grand jury who did what and when they did it. 3 months later, at 11:30 in the morning, right in front of a market in Liberty City, a man named Leon was hit. This was the second attempt. He was still healing up from last time, and his leg was still in a cast, but they didn't give him time to heal. They returned to finish the job, and while he was on crutches, they did him dirty. He didn't make it. Right after that, the B-Boys would strike again. This time, it was a family member of Avonda and his friend. Both were hit. The family member survived, but the friend, he didn't make it. Vonda's gang would retaliate by getting revenge on a man named Terrence. He was hit with an assault. He didn't make it. In 1996, a hustler in Miami, let's call him Ronnie. Ronnie got pulled over by a uniformed police officer. The officer searched his car, found some bundles of powder and $15,000 in cash. The officer took everything he found and let Ronnie off with a warning. With the risk of getting himself in trouble, Ronnie wasn't having it. He was upset, so he reported the incident, and that report landed on the desk of a detective of internal affairs. As for the violence, it kept going. The B-Boys hit a man named Moses and left him on the cold concrete at 11 p.m. Then another one named Jesse. He didn't make it. B-Boys made everything a family affair, and 2 days later they stalked Jesse's brother and made him a victim of the war. Another victim of the B-Boys was a man named Tarvis. He became a victim when a car drove by and unloaded. The street speculated that Casado was involved. So a few weeks later, Robert and other members of Vonda's gang would get revenge as they unloaded from an assault, causing injuries to Casado, his 2-year-old child, and a female. In 97, the violence would continue. Another man would get hit. He was on the receiving side for messing around with Vonda's gang. The next day, police officers saw a black car riding around in Vonda's territory in Overtown. When the cops tried to pull them over for a traffic stop, the driver stepped on the gas and a car chase started. The crooks in the car started throwing weapons out the windows as the driver tried to lose the cops, hot on their trail. They finally pulled over on a dark street and everybody hopped out of the car and ran. Kenneth was caught hiding behind a pile of wood. Casado ran into someone's house and was found hiding in a shower. Kenneth and Casado and the other members in the car were armed with assault rifles, camouflage clothing, armored vests, and they were just ready for war. It was discovered that they were on their way to take care of Vonda's top hitter, Robert Sawyer. Robert is top enforcer for Vonda's gang. Miami law enforcement labeled him a one-man crime spree. The things that he did to the face of members and associates of the Boobie Boys are too gruesome to talk about. Back in the getaway car, the detective found a stolen ATM card that belonged to a victim that a few weeks ago reported to police that someone put a gun in her face and took her wallet with her ID and ATM card. She would later identify Kenneth as the man who put the gun in her face. B-Boys would strike again, hitting 2 men with assault rifles. The first one named Smith survived, but the second man named Damien, he didn't make it. A few months would pass by, and they knew they had to get rid of Smith, so they plotted, and when they saw him, they hit him up again, for the second time. During the second trial with Smith, they also hit another man named Billy, and Billy was lucky. He survived 30 rounds from an assault rifle. 2 months later, the B-Boys tried to get rid of Robert again, but he survived. While driving to get Robert, the B-Boys also hit a woman. Her name was Yvonne. That same month, a few police officers that worked for the B-Boys would be arrested. The story went like this. A few hustlers bought some bundles of powder from members of the Boobie Boys. After the deal went through, the hustlers left, and at some point got pulled over by police officers who searched the car and took the duffel bags with the bundles in it and $20,000 in cash. Little did they know, the hustlers was really undercover cops from the Internal Affairs investigation. The B-Boys had crooked officers that were assigned to the Carroll City District working for them. A government witness testified that some of the crooked cops involved in the scheme directly worked for Kenneth and his team. 30 days later, after the arrest of the crooked cops, the Boobie Boys went back to finish the job, and again, they ran down on Robert, Vonda's top lieutenant. But once again, he survived. See, Robert was punishing members and associates of the B-Boys. He was a one-man crime spree, so the B-Boys needed to get rid of him. Vonda's gang ended the year by finally getting rid of Rogers. He didn't make it. That's the guy who dropped his beeper on the scene of the crime 3 years back. The first time Vonda's gang went after Rogers, he escaped, but this time, Robert and Jamal made sure it was a done deal. The B-Boys found out that Robert did it, so they put money on his head. Robert was the one in charge when they went to Casado's house and tried to get rid of him and his child, but didn't fully complete the job.
No one in the community is immune. Innocent bystanders, beware.
By this time, so many innocent people became victims of this street war, a special federal task force was formed to preserve the safety of the general public. Law enforcement interviewed informants and addicts for information about Miami's underworld. Early 1998, the B-Boys would set the year off with revenge against a lieutenant of Vonda's gang. They found Jamal Brown and unloaded. He survived, but was left paralyzed for the rest of his life. Another family member of Vonda would also get hit for the second time right outside of her house. The next month, 2 men were at a gas station, and at the same time, a Nissan Altima pulled up. 2 men wearing camouflage, ski masks, and armored vests got out with assault rifles and unloaded. They were professional hitters. After they were done, they hopped back in the Nissan and drove off. And 2 blocks away, they got out of the Nissan and they hopped into a Toyota Camry. They left the assault rifles and ski mask in the Nissan. The Toyota was rented by a man named Richard, who was a known hitter for the B-Boys. The fire department was later called to a raging fire. When they got there, they found a Toyota Camry up in flames. A prison snitch told law enforcement that the driver was this guy. He also told them why they did it. After more eyewitnesses came forth, the B-Boy that was identified as the driver cut off his dreads. After further investigation, the owner of the Nissan already had reported it stolen, and his cell phone was in the car when it was taken. This is significant because that stolen cell phone was used to make a call to the girlfriend of a man named Corey. This was an excellent clue for detectives assigned to this case. Corey was the weak link. So word on the street is a few months later, members of his own crew set him up. Corey didn't make it. Corey's lawyer, Karen, later testified that Corey did admit to her that he was one of the shooters at the double murder at the gas station. It was revenge by the B-Boys against Vonda's gang for another event that injured one of the B-Boys 30 days earlier. Another man named Tyson would get hit after having an issue with the B-Boys. 2 days later, another man named Davis would suffer the same fate after having an issue with the B-Boys. At the end of February, the government announced the results of the investigation. They were able to link more than 30 lost souls and hundreds of shootings to the street beef between these violent organizations.
Kenneth Williams and his group is responsible for 30 plus and well over 100 non-critical shootings in Dade County alone.
So for the health and well-being of the general public, they got creative. They had to get these violent men and women off the streets. So months ago, a task force was formed. That task force was a joint operation of local and federal law enforcement, which increased the resources that could be used against the gangsters in Miami. The feds started looking at all the old cases that were committed by felons that used a firearm during a crime. For whatever the reason, the state cases were dismissed from state courts, but those cases were now subjected to federal courts with mandatory minimums. Law enforcement started rounding up these felons, which included Vonda, Kenneth Boobie Williams, and their top hitmen and hustlers. So one by one, members of the Boobie Boys, John Doe's, Thomas Gang, and Vonda's gang were getting locked up with 10-year minimums. This took them off the streets for at least 10 years, which took effect on the whole city of Miami. This caused violent crimes like drive-bys to drop 80%. It kept the violent ones off the streets and created a situation where everyone from Vonda's gang and the B-Boys started to snitch on each other and started telling gang secrets in order to shorten their time behind bars. Sometime around 1998, Vonda was arrested and would remain in prison for a few years while going to trial and fighting her case from behind bars. While they were off the streets, law enforcement was able to work on more permanent charges. They grouped all the crimes together as organized crime. Then they spoke to imprisoned gang members and associates who would trade information for reduced sentences. This was just what the government needed. 2 months later, it was reported that 2 people, a man named Scott and a woman named Williams, would get hit in the crossfire by members of Vonda's gang. They were both innocent bystanders, and Miss Williams would be left paralyzed for the rest of her life. A month later, Vonda and Kenneth were both indicted. Kenneth went on a run and became a fugitive with a reward today valued at $105,000. One of the twins, Bo Brown, was caught in September. He was wanted for a murder that happened at a market at the beginning of the year. That one was caught on camera. On camera, he was seen walking up on 5 men. When he got close, about 3 feet away, he unloaded on all 5 of them.
Police state 2 hitmen, twin brothers Leonard and Leonard Brown, were sent in to eliminate the other group and send a message from Williams.
Kenneth would be featured on America's Most Wanted for being a suspect responsible for 15 lost souls. That same month, the Miami-Dade police officer that worked for the B-Boys was arrested. He was the 3rd cop associated with the scheme to rob dealers. By the end of 1998, 30 members of the gangs in Miami would be arrested. Kenneth, however, would remain on the run. The next year, in 99, 15 more members of the B-Boys were arrested. By now, the whole gang was torn apart. It was all coming to an end, because 2 days later, Kenneth was finally captured in a suburb in Georgia. It turns out, law enforcement had him under surveillance for 2 weeks, and on a Monday afternoon they pulled him over while he was driving with a fake driver's license. One of the Brown twins, Leonard, at 21 years old, suffered a heart attack on a Friday while awaiting trial in a Miami detention center. He didn't make it. One of his charges was attempted murder of Avonda's top hitter, Robert. At the beginning of the year 2000, the trial begins. More than 100 witnesses would take the stand. A lot of them were criminals, and of those criminals, more than 30 of them were felons that cooperated so they could get time off of their own sentence. Some of them were also members of the B-Boys that removed people during the war with Vonda and the Thomas gang. Some of them were associates that did business with the B-Boys, and then Kenneth set them up to get robbed by crooked cops after they sold them product fresh off the boat. They found out Kenneth set them up during information disclosure, before and during the trial, so they couldn't wait to get revenge by telling on him and his organization. Some of the members even did jailhouse interviews, and with all these informants and snitches, and literally hundreds of hours of testimony and recorded conversations, it brought the house down on everybody. It's important to understand that this was not just a case about more than 30 souls that didn't make it. It was also a case about acts of crimes that could be proven that was in furtherance of a powder conspiracy. Let me repeat that. It was also a case about acts of crime that could be proven that was in furtherance of a powder conspiracy. And that is what most of these men and women were charged with. After weeks of trial, everybody got convicted. The corrupt police officers each received 15 to 20 years in prison. Susan, the mother of the Brown twins, got 30 years in prison. Avonda somehow got lucky and received 20 years in prison. Bo Brown was sentenced to life in prison. Casado was sentenced to life in prison. Kenneth also received a life sentence. Jamal argued against his sentence, stating that Vonda was the leader of the gang and she got less time than he did, and since he was a paraplegic, he didn't deserve his sentence. The other members of the Boobie Boys and Vonda's gang were sentenced to life in prison, and the lucky ones received 30 and 40-year sentences. This was the story of a group of men that ran wild in the streets of Miami. Law enforcement called them the Boobie Boys. If you enjoyed this content, click on the next episode from Big City Crime TV.